Every morning, Judge Marcus Thompson woke up with the same routine. The sun would peek through the blinds of his bedroom window, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. He'd sit up in bed, stretch his arms above his head, and take a deep breath. It was a ritual he had followed for years, a moment to prepare himself mentally for the day ahead. His role as a judge wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a responsibility he took seriously. Every decision he made in court could change someone's life forever, and that weight rested heavily on his shoulders. After brushing his teeth and washing his face, Judge Thompson walked to his closet. There, hanging neatly beside his suits, was his black robe, the symbol of his authority and position. Slipping it on felt like putting on armor, a reminder of the power and fairness he represented. Today, like every other day, he chose one of his favorite ties to wear underneath. A simple blue one, nothing flashy, because he believed even small details mattered when commanding respect. Once dressed, he headed to the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee greeted him. He poured himself a cup, added a splash of cream, and leaned against the counter as he sipped. For those few quiet minutes, he let his mind wander. What cases awaited him today? Would there be disputes over property lines or heated arguments about custody battles? Or perhaps something more serious, criminal charges, accusations of fraud, or even violent crimes? Each case required focus, patience, and an open mind. With his coffee finished, Judge Thompson grabbed his leather briefcase from the dining table. Inside were stacks of documents, motions, affidavits, and summaries of upcoming trials. These papers weren't just pieces of paper to him, they told stories. Stories of people's lives, their struggles, their mistakes, and sometimes their triumphs. As he locked the front door behind him, he reminded himself why he did what he did. Justice wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. The drive to the courthouse was short, no more than 15 minutes. Judge Thompson enjoyed the solitude of the car ride, listening to soft jazz playing on the radio. The streets were already bustling with activity. People rushing to work, kids waiting at bus stops, delivery trucks unloading goods. But none of that chaos reached inside his car. Here, he found peace. Occasionally, he'd glance at the rearview mirror, catching sight of his own reflection, his salt and pepper beard, his sharp eyes, the lines etched into his face by years of experience, all reminders of the journey that brought him here. When he arrived at the courthouse parking lot, he pulled into his usual spot reserved for judges. The space was close to the entrance, convenient for someone who often carried heavy files. Stepping out of the car, he straightened his tie and adjusted his robe. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. Fall was his favorite season, and he paused for a moment to appreciate the vibrant colors surrounding the courthouse grounds. Red, orange, and yellow leaves swirled gently in the breeze, creating a picturesque scene. As Judge Thompson approached the main entrance, he noticed a group of lawyers chatting near the steps. They nodded respectfully as he passed, some offering polite greetings. "Good morning, Your Honor," one said with a smile. He returned the gesture, exchanging pleasantries before continuing onward. Everything seemed normal, predictable even. Nothing hinted at the disruption that was about to occur. But then, just as he reached the top of the stairs leading to the courthouse doors, a figure stepped into his path. It was a police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a uniform that seemed too stiff, too formal for such an ordinary day. The officer's nameplate read Hayes. His hand rested casually but noticeably on the grip of his holstered gun. At first, Judge Thompson didn't think much of it. Officers often patrolled the area, ensuring security around the courthouse. But when Officer Hayes spoke, his tone was anything but routine. "Sir, can I see some ID?" the officer asked, his voice firm and commanding. Judge Thompson froze mid-step, confusion flickering across his face. ID? Why would he need to show identification? He glanced down at his robe, then back at the officer. Surely the man could see he was a judge. Wasn't it obvious? Still, Judge Thompson decided to remain calm. Raising his hand slightly in a non-threatening gesture, he replied, Officer, I'm Judge Marcus Thompson. I work here. For a split second, there was silence. Then Officer Hayes narrowed his eyes, suspicion evident in his expression. I'll need to see some proof of that, he said, his tone unchanged. The absurdity of the situation hit Judge Thompson like a punch to the gut. How could this man not recognize him? Hadn't they crossed paths before during previous visits? Or was this something else entirely? Something darker? Judge Thompson felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he forced himself to stay composed. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. I assure you, officer, I am who I say I am, he said, his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Here's my identification. As he handed over his credentials, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was about more than just mistaken identity. It was about assumptions, biases, and the color of his skin. And as much as he wanted to believe otherwise, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced something like this. Little did he know, however, that this encounter was only the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the courthouse steps. Judge Marcus Thompson stood still, his wallet halfway back into his pocket as Officer Hayes scrutinized the ID card. The officer's eyes darted between the photo on the card and Judge Thompson's face, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, it hardened further as if he were trying to find fault with what was clearly a legitimate identification. This says you're a judge, Officer Hayes finally said, his voice laced with skepticism. You expect me to believe that? The words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and dismissive. Judge Thompson blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the question. He had spent decades building his career, earning respect in the Yao legal community, and yet here he was, being questioned by someone who seemed determined not to believe him. His mind raced, trying to process how this situation had escalated so quickly. I don't expect anything, Judge Thompson replied evenly, his tone measured, despite the tension rising inside him. It's a fact. I am Judge Marcus Thompson, and I preside over courtroom 3B. You can verify this with anyone inside. He gestured toward the courthouse doors, where people were beginning to filter through. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, all familiar faces who knew him well. Surely, one of them would step forward and confirm his identity. But Officer Hayes didn't budge. If anything, his stance grew more rigid, his hand still hovering near the grip of his holstered gun. I'll need to call this in, he said, pulling out his radio. His actions were deliberate, almost theatrical, as though he wanted everyone watching to see him asserting authority. Judge Thompson felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't just about verifying his identity anymore. It was about control. And in that moment, he realized something unsettling. Officer Hayes wasn't treating him like a judge. He was treating him like a suspect. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Judge Thompson. Here he was, a man whose life revolved around upholding justice, now standing in the shadow of an accusation he couldn't escape. He glanced around, noticing that a small crowd had begun to gather. Some passers-by slowed their pace, curious about the commotion. Others stopped entirely, whispering among themselves. A few courthouse employees lingered nearby, hesitant to intervene but clearly uneasy about what they were witnessing. One woman, a court clerk named Lisa, finally stepped forward. She had worked with Judge Thompson for years and recognized him instantly. "Officer," she called out, her voice tentative but firm, "that's Judge Thompson, he's telling the truth." Officer Hayes turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence without fully engaging. "Ma'am, please stay back," he said curtly. "This is official police business." Lisa hesitated, glancing at Judge Thompson for guidance. He gave her a subtle nod, silently urging her not to press further. Confrontation wouldn't help. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, refusing to let anger cloud his judgment. He knew all too well how emotions could spiral out of control in situations like this. But even as he tried to remain calm, he couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. The way Officer Hayes's words dripped with doubt, the way his body language conveyed distrust. "Officer Hayes," Judge Thompson said, injecting a note of authority into his voice. "You're making a mistake. I understand you have a duty to ensure security, but detaining me like this serves no purpose. Let me go about my day and we can resolve this later if necessary." Hayes stiffened as if offended by the suggestion. "Detaining you?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "I'm just doing my job, sir. Maybe you should think twice before accusing me of misconduct." The comment stung, but Judge Thompson refused to rise to the bait. Instead, he took a step back, creating some distance between himself and the officer. He needed space, not just physically, but mentally. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered prejudice, but it rarely happened in such a public setting. Usually these moments were subtle, hidden behind closed doors or masked by polite smiles. Today, however, there was no hiding. Everyone could see exactly what was happening. As the minutes dragged on, the crowd continued to grow. Whispers turned into murmurs and murmurs into outright conversations. Someone snapped a photo with their phone, the flash catching Judge Thompson off guard. He winced, realizing that this incident was no longer private. Whatever happened next would be recorded, shared, dissected. Social media would amplify it, turning a personal affront into a public spectacle. Despite the growing attention, Officer Hayes showed no signs of backing down. In fact, his demeanor grew increasingly confrontational. "You know," he said, his voice louder now, "it's funny how quick people are to play the victim these days. Maybe if you carried yourself differently, none of this would have happened." The remark hit like a punch to the gut. Judge Thompson felt his jaw tighten, his fists clench involuntarily. It took every ounce of self-control not to respond in kind. Playing the victim? Was that really how this officer saw him? Did he genuinely believe that Judge Thompson deserved this treatment because of how he looked or carried himself? The implications were staggering, and they cut deeper than any insult. Before he could formulate a response, another voice joined the fray. This time, it belonged to David Chen, a defense attorney who frequently appeared in Judge Thompson's courtroom. "Officer, enough is enough," David said, stepping closer. "We all know Judge Thompson. There's no reason to keep harassing him." Harassment. The word hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Officer Hayes bristled, his cheeks flushing red. "I'm not harassing anyone," he shot back. "I'm following protocol. If you don't like it, take it up with my supervisor." David opened his mouth to argue, but Judge Thompson intervened. "That's enough," he said firmly, addressing both men. "This isn't helping anyone." Turning to Officer Hayes, he added, "If you insist on verifying my identity, do so, but understand that your behavior is unacceptable. I will file a formal complaint once this is resolved." For the first time since the encounter began, Officer Hayes faltered. The confidence that had fueled his earlier remarks wavered, replaced by uncertainty. Filing a complaint carried consequences, and he knew it. Still, he couldn't bring himself to apologize. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked a few steps away, pretending to consult his radio. In the silence that followed, Judge Thompson exhaled slowly, releasing some of the tension that had built up inside him. He glanced at the crowd, meeting the eyes of those who had gathered. Some looked sympathetic, others outraged, and a few simply confused. But regardless of their reactions, one thing was clear. This incident had struck a nerve. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the broader issues of trust, respect, and fairness, or the lack thereof. As the standoff dragged on, Judge Thompson made a decision. He wouldn't let this moment define him. Yes, it was infuriating, humiliating even, but he had faced challenges before, and he would face them again. What mattered most was how he responded. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his posture and addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for your concern," he said, his voice steady and strong. "Let's allow the officer to complete his duties, and then we can move forward. Justice will prevail, as it always does." His words resonated, drawing nods of agreement from several onlookers. Even Officer Hayes seemed momentarily taken aback by the grace with which Judge Thompson handled the situation. For a brief moment, it felt like the tension might ease. But deep down, Judge Thompson knew this was far from over. The encounter had planted seeds of doubt, resentment, and anger, not just within him but within the community that had witnessed it. And as he finally entered the courthouse, flanked by colleagues who offered quiet support, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung shut behind Judge Marcus Thompson, muffling the murmurs of the crowd outside. For a moment, he stood still in the grand lobby, letting the cool, air-conditioned breeze wash over him. His heart was pounding not from exertion, but from the emotional weight of what had just transpired. The encounter with Officer Hayes lingered in his mind, like an unwelcome shadow, refusing to fade. He knew that stepping inside didn't mean leaving the incident behind. It would follow him, shaping the rest of his day and perhaps even days to come. As he walked toward the elevators, several courthouse employees approached him, their faces etched with concern. "Your Honor, are you okay?" one asked softly, her voice trembling with unease. Another offered a reassuring pat on the shoulder, while a third whispered, "That shouldn't have happened. Not to you." Their words were well-meaning, but they only served to remind Judge Thompson of how public and how humiliating the situation had become. He forced a small smile, nodding to acknowledge their support, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Inside, the elevator. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The ride up to the third floor felt endless, each ding of the passing floors echoing loudly in the confined space. When the doors finally opened, he stepped out into the familiar hallway lined with portraits of past judges. These faces stared back at him, silent witnesses to decades of justice served. Today, however, he couldn't help but wonder, would any of them have faced something like this? Or was this uniquely his burden to bear? His courtroom 3B, was already bustling with activity when he arrived. Lawyers shuffled papers, bailiffs adjusted their uniforms, and court reporters tested their stenography machines. Normally, the organized chaos brought him comfort. It was the rhythm of his life's work. But today it felt distant, almost surreal. As he entered through the judge's private entrance, his clerk, Sarah, looked up from her desk. Her expression shifted immediately from professional neutrality to genuine worry. "Judge Thompson," she said, rising from her chair, "I heard about what happened outside. Are you all right?" He hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I'm fine, Sarah. Thank you for asking. But I need to focus on the cases ahead. Let's make sure everything runs smoothly today." Sarah nodded, though her furrowed brow suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She handed him a folder containing the day's docket, and he glanced at it briefly. A custody dispute, a breach of contract case, and a criminal trial. All routine matters that required his full attention. Yet as he took his seat on the bench moments later, he found it difficult to concentrate. Every time he looked out at the gallery, he saw flashes of the crowd outside, their phones raised, capturing images of him standing there, powerless against Officer Hayes's accusations. The first case began without delay. Two parents argued bitterly over visitation rights, their voices rising in frustration. Judge Thompson listened intently, interjecting occasionally to remind them of courtroom decorum. On any other day, he might have been fully immersed in the details of the case, weighing each argument carefully. But today, his mind kept drifting, back to the confrontation. Why had Officer Hayes refused to believe him? Was it truly a matter of mistaken identity, or was there something deeper at play? The questions gnawed at him, making it hard to maintain the detachment his role demanded. By mid-morning, news of the incident had spread throughout the courthouse like wildfire. Courthouse staff whispered in hushed tones during breaks, while attorneys debated the implications in hallways. Some expressed outrage, calling the officer's behavior unprofessional and racially motivated. Others defended the officer, claiming he was simply following protocol. The divide was palpable, creating an undercurrent of tension that permeated every interaction. During a recess between cases, Judge Thompson retreated to his chambers, seeking refuge from the prying eyes and speculative glances. Sitting at his desk, he stared blankly at the stack of files in front of him. For once, the legal jargon and complex arguments held no interest for him. Instead, his thoughts turned inward. He replayed the scene outside again and again, dissecting every word, every gesture. Had he handled it correctly? Should he have been more assertive? More patient? A soft knock on the door interrupted his reflection. It was David Chen, the defense attorney who had spoken up earlier. "Your Honor," David said cautiously, stepping inside. "Do you have a moment?" Judge Thompson gestured for him to sit. "Of course, Mr. Chen, what can I do for you?" David hesitated, clearly unsure how to broach the subject. "I wanted to check in on you. That situation outside, it was unacceptable. You deserved better." "Thank you," Judge Thompson replied, his tone measured. "But as you can imagine, I'd prefer not to dwell on it right now. My focus has to remain on the cases before me." David nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't ready to let the matter drop. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this isn't something you should have to brush aside. People are talking about what happened, about what it means. If anyone deserves answers, it's you." Judge Thompson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Chen. Truly I do. But I'm not interested in turning this into a spectacle. Yes, what happened was wrong. Yes, it hurt. But my job is to ensure justice is served, not just for myself, but for everyone who walks through these doors. If I start treating this courthouse like a battleground for personal grievances, then I've failed in my duty." David studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're a better man than most, Your Honor. Just don't forget that you're allowed to feel angry. You're allowed to demand accountability." "I won't forget," Judge Thompson promised, "but anger won't solve anything, not today." When David left, Judge Thompson returned to his desk, picking up the next file in the pile. As he prepared to head back into the courtroom, he caught sight of himself in the mirror hanging on the wall. The man staring back at him looked tired, older somehow. Lines creased his forehead, and his usually sharp eyes seemed dull. He straightened, his tie smoothing out imaginary wrinkles, and reminded himself of why he was here. Justice wasn't always easy, and fairness often came at a cost. But it was worth it. Always. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session resumed. This time, Judge Thompson forced himself to push aside the lingering thoughts of the morning, focused on the individuals before him, their stories, their struggles, their hopes. In doing so, he found a measure of peace. Each ruling he delivered, each decision he made, reinforced his belief in the system he served. Imperfect though it was, it relied on people like him to uphold its integrity. As the final case concluded and the gavel struck for the last time that day, Judge Thompson felt a flicker of relief. The day had been long, emotionally taxing, and far from ordinary. But he had persevered, carrying out his responsibilities despite the storm swirling around him. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, he paused by the window overlooking the courthouse steps. Outside, the crowd had dispersed, leaving behind only faint traces of the drama that had unfolded. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself, not just as a judge, but as a symbol of resilience. And though the scars of today's encounter would remain, he vowed to rise above them. After all, justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about inspiring change, fostering understanding, and proving that dignity could withstand even the harshest tests. By the time Judge Marcus Thompson stepped out of the courthouse that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the steps. The air was crisp, carrying a slight chill that hinted at the approaching winter. Normally, he would have taken a moment to appreciate the quiet beauty of the evening, the way the streetlights flickered on one by one, illuminating the empty sidewalks. But tonight, his mind was elsewhere. As he walked toward his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching him, even though the crowd from earlier had long since dispersed. The drive home felt longer than usual. Traffic moved sluggishly, and every red light seemed to stretch into eternity. Judge Thompson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. His thoughts churned like stormy waves, replaying fragments of the day's events over and over again. The confrontation with Officer Hayes, the murmurs of the crowd, the sympathetic looks from colleagues, it all swirled together in an endless loop. He had tried to compartmentalize, to focus on his work as he always did, but now, alone in the silence of his car, there was no escaping the weight of what had happened. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he sat for a moment, staring at the house before him. It was modest yet welcoming, with flower beds lining the front yard and warm light spilling from the windows. This was his sanctuary, the place where he could leave behind the pressures of the courtroom and simply be himself. But tonight, even the sight of his home offered little comfort. He climbed out of the car, retrieved his briefcase, and trudged up the steps to the front door. Inside, the house was quiet. His wife, Evelyn, was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She glanced up as he entered, her smile fading when she saw the look on his face. "Marcus," she said softly, setting down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "What's wrong?" He hesitated, unsure where to begin. How could he explain something that still didn't fully make sense to him? Taking a deep breath, he recounted the incident step by step. The officer stopping him, the refusal to accept his credentials, the growing crowd, the whispered accusations of harassment. Evelyn listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to anger. "That's unbelievable," she said finally, shaking her head. "How dare they treat you like that? You're a judge, for heaven's sake." Judge Thompson sank into a chair at the kitchen table, running a hand over his face. "It's not just about me, Evelyn. It's about what this says about how people see us, how some people see us. No matter how far I've come, no matter how much I've achieved, there are still those who can't, or won't, look past the color of my skin." Evelyn moved to sit beside him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "I know it's unfair, and I know it hurts, but you can't let them win, Marcus. You've spent your whole life fighting for justice. Don't let one bad experience make you doubt yourself or your purpose." Her words struck a chord, but they didn't erase the ache in his chest. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded him. His mind raced with questions. What should he do next? Should he file a formal complaint against Officer Hayes? Would it even make a difference? Or would it only add fuel to the fire, turning the incident into a media circus? The next morning, Judge Thompson woke early, unable to shake the restless energy coursing through him. He turned on the news while getting ready, half expecting to see coverage of the previous day's events. Sure enough, there it was, a segment discussing the altercation outside the courthouse. Clips of the encounter played on screen, accompanied by commentary from reporters and interviews with witnesses. Social media posts flooded the screen, some condemning Officer Hayes' actions, others defending him. Hashtags like "Trying Justice for Judge Thompson" and "Courthouse controversy" trended online. As the story gained traction, public reaction intensified. Community leaders called for accountability, demanding an investigation into the police department's handling of the situation. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Respect our judges" and "End racial profiling." Meanwhile, critics argued that Officer Hayes was merely doing his job, pointing to vague claims of heightened security measures around government buildings. Amidst the chaos, Judge Thompson found himself caught in the middle. Reporters camped outside his house, hoping to catch a glimpse of him leaving for work. Calls poured in from friends, family members, and strangers alike, offering support or advice. Some urged him to take legal action, others cautioned him to stay silent. The pressure mounted, weighing heavily on his shoulders. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Security had been tightened, with additional officers stationed at entrances and metal detectors set up in the lobby. While these measures were intended to reassure the public, they only served to remind Judge Thompson of the fragility of trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Colleagues approached him cautiously, unsure whether to offer condolences or avoid mentioning the incident altogether. During a break between cases, Sarah, his clerk, knocked on the door of his chambers. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, "There's someone here to see you. A reporter from the local news station. They want to ask you a few questions about, well, you know." Judge Thompson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Tell them I'm unavailable. I don't have anything to say right now." Sarah nodded and left, but the interruption lingered in his mind. How could he remain impartial if he allowed himself to become embroiled in controversy? Yet at the same time, staying silent felt like complicity. Wasn't it his responsibility to speak out against injustice, especially when he had experienced it firsthand? That afternoon, during another recess, Judge Thompson decided to seek counsel from someone whose perspective he trusted implicitly. Judge Cynthia Martinez, a senior judge and mentor figure within the courthouse. Her chambers were located on the same floor, and he knocked lightly on her door before entering. "Cynthia," he began, taking a seat across from her desk, "I need your advice. I'm not sure how to handle everything that's happening." Judge Martinez listened patiently as he recounted the events leading up to the present moment. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands thoughtfully. "Marcus," she said after a pause, "you're facing a difficult decision, and there's no easy answer. If you choose to pursue a formal complaint, it will shine a light on systemic issues that desperately need addressing, but it will also put you under immense scrutiny, both personally and professionally. And if I don't?" he asked quietly. "Then you risk sending the message that such behavior is acceptable," she replied. "But ultimately the choice is yours. Just remember why you became a judge in the first place. Use that as your guiding principle." Her words resonated deeply with him. That evening, after returning home and sharing his conversation with Evelyn, Judge Thompson made a decision. He would file a formal complaint, not out of vengeance or bitterness, but because it was the right thing to do. By speaking up, he hoped to spark a broader conversation about bias and accountability within law enforcement. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't resolve overnight, but it was a step forward. The following day, Judge Thompson submitted his complaint to the police department's Internal Affairs Division. Within hours, the story exploded across national headlines. News outlets picked up the narrative, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing dialogue about race and authority. For Judge Thompson, the attention was overwhelming, but he refused to let it deter him. Every interview request, every article, written every social media post reminded him of the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. Though the days ahead promised challenges, Judge Thompson felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that true change required patience, persistence, and courage. And as he prepared for another day in court, he reminded himself of the words that had guided him throughout his career. Justice isn't always easy, but it's always worth fighting for. The days following Judge Marcus Thompson's decision to file a formal complaint against Officer Hayes were a whirlwind of activity. News outlets couldn't get enough of the story, and it seemed like every major network had sent reporters to camp outside the courthouse steps. Camera crews jostled for position, microphones extended toward anyone who might offer a comment. Lawyers, court staff, even random passers-by. The media frenzy was relentless, painting Judge Thompson as both a victim and a symbol of resistance against systemic bias. Inside the courthouse, however, life continued much as it always had. Cases were heard, rulings were delivered, and the steady hum of legal proceedings filled the halls. But beneath the surface, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Lawyers whispered about the incident during breaks, their voices hushed but urgent. Court clerks exchanged knowing glances when the topic came up. Even the bailiffs, usually stoic and unflappable, seemed more alert, as though bracing for some kind of fallout. For Judge Thompson, navigating this new reality required extraordinary focus. He arrived at the courthouse early each morning, hoping to avoid the throng of reporters waiting outside. Once inside, he retreated to his chambers where he could gather his thoughts before stepping into the courtroom. Each day brought its own set of challenges, not just from the cases themselves, but from the weight of public scrutiny. Every ruling he made, every word he spoke, felt magnified under the microscope of national attention. Despite the chaos swirling around him, Judge Thompson refused to let it distract him from his primary duty, ensuring justice was served. In one particularly contentious case, a landlord accused a tenant of damaging property, while the tenant claimed they were being unfairly evicted. Both sides presented compelling arguments, and emotions ran high. As Judge Thompson listened intently, he reminded himself that fairness wasn't about choosing sides. It was about weighing evidence objectively and making decisions based on the law. When he finally issued his verdict, siding with the tenant due to insufficient proof of damage, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Some cheered quietly, while others grumbled in frustration. It was a reminder that no matter how carefully he ruled, someone would always be unhappy. That was the nature of his job. Outside the courtroom, the investigation into Officer Hayes' conduct proceeded behind closed doors. Internal affairs officers reviewed surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, and examined the officer's record for patterns of misconduct. Meanwhile, the police department issued a statement expressing regret over the incident, but stopped short of admitting wrongdoing. "We are committed to transparency and accountability," the statement read. "However, we must allow the investigative process to unfold without jumping to conclusions." To many, the response felt inadequate. Protesters continued to gather outside the courthouse, their numbers growing with each passing day. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice over Bias" and "Accountability Now" dotted the landscape, while chants echoed through the streets. Community leaders took turns addressing the crowd, urging calm but also demanding action. Among them was Reverend James Holloway, a prominent civil rights advocate who had long championed equality and reform. Standing atop a makeshift platform, he raised his voice above the din. "This isn't just about one man or one moment," Reverend Holloway declared. "It's about dismantling the structures of prejudice that have plagued our society for far too long. We stand here today not only for Judge Thompson, but for every person who has ever been treated as less than human because of the color of their skin." His words struck a chord with the crowd, drawing cheers and applause. For Judge Thompson, watching clips of the rally later that evening, the outpouring of support was both humbling and bittersweet. He appreciated the solidarity, but he couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness. Why did progress so often require pain? Why did it take moments like this to force people to confront uncomfortable truths? As the weeks passed, the investigation dragged on, fueling frustration among those calling for swift justice. Critics accused the police department of stalling, pointing to similar incidents in the past where officers had faced little to no consequences for questionable behavior. Supporters of Officer Hayes, meanwhile, argued that he was being unfairly targeted, claiming that the backlash stemmed from political correctness rather than facts. The divide grew wider, with tempers flaring on both sides. One afternoon, as Judge Thompson prepared to leave the courthouse, he encountered Officer Hayes himself. The officer was standing near the entrance, flanked by two colleagues. Their eyes met briefly, and for a split second neither man moved. Then Officer Hayes looked away, his expression unreadable. Judge Thompson felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, pity, even a flicker of understanding. Whatever the outcome of the investigation, he knew that Officer Hayes' life would never be the same. Whether intentional or not, the officer's actions had ignited a firestorm, and the repercussions would ripple far beyond either of them. Later that week, the results of the internal affairs investigation were announced. Officer Hayes was formally reprimanded and reassigned to desk duty, pending further evaluation. Additionally, the police department pledged to implement mandatory bias training for all officers and increase oversight of interactions involving judges and other officials. While some hailed the decision as a victory, others criticized it as insufficient. Protesters demanded stronger measures, including termination of Officer Hayes and broader reforms within the department. Judge Thompson watched the announcement on television, his feelings mixed. On one hand, he was relieved that the situation had been addressed, however imperfectly. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the lingering sense that true accountability remained elusive. Filing the complaint had been the right thing to do, but it hadn't erased the sting of humiliation or the knowledge that countless others had endured similar experiences without receiving justice. In the days that followed, Judge Thompson began to reflect on what the incident meant, not just for him personally, but for the larger conversation about race, power, and respect. He realized that while the confrontation with Officer Hayes had been painful, it had also created an opportunity. People were talking, really talking, about issues that had long been swept under the rug. Conversations were happening in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms across the country. Social media platforms buzzed with debates, sharing personal stories and calls for change. Determined to keep the momentum going, Judge Thompson decided to use his platform to amplify these discussions. He partnered with local organizations to host community forums, inviting experts, activists, and everyday citizens to share their perspectives. One evening, speaking to a packed auditorium, he addressed the audience with quiet conviction. "What happened to me was wrong," he said, his voice steady, "but it wasn't unique. Too many people face discrimination daily, not just in isolated incidents, but in systems that fail to recognize their humanity. My hope is that we can learn from this moment and work together to build a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. That starts with listening, learning, and taking action." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the room with a sense of unity and purpose. For Judge Thompson, it was a powerful reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about inspiring change, fostering empathy, and proving that even in the darkest moments, light could prevail. As he stepped off the stage that night, greeted by smiles and handshakes, Judge Thompson allowed himself a small measure of optimism. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he believed in the resilience of the human spirit. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but with persistence and determination, it was possible. And for now, that belief was enough to carry him forward. Months passed since the incident at the courthouse, and though the initial storm of media attention had begun to subside, its impact lingered. Judge Marcus Thompson found himself navigating a world that felt subtly different, both in how people interacted with him and in his own perspective on life. The confrontation with Officer Hayes had left an indelible mark, not just on him personally, but also on the community he served. It was as if a crack had been opened in the facade of normalcy, revealing truths that could no longer be ignored. In the aftermath, Judge Thompson became more than just a jurist. He transformed into a figurehead for change. His name appeared in opinion pieces, podcasts, and panel discussions about race, law enforcement, and systemic bias. Schools invited him to speak at assemblies, where students sat wide-eyed, listening to stories of perseverance and calls for unity. Local businesses hosted workshops inspired by his advocacy efforts, encouraging employees to examine their own biases and work toward creating inclusive environments. What started as a single moment of injustice had blossomed into something far greater, a movement fueled by collective hope. But for all the progress being made, Judge Thompson knew better than anyone that change didn't come easily or quickly. He saw reminders of this every day, whether it was in the lingering skepticism some colleagues expressed during conversations about reform or in the occasional anonymous letter criticizing his actions. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering insidious questions. Was he doing enough? Could one person really make a difference? On those days, Evelyn would remind him of the countless lives he'd touched simply by refusing to stay silent. "You're planting seeds, Marcus," she told him one evening over dinner. "Seeds don't grow overnight, but they do grow, and someday someone will look back and realize that everything you've done helped shape the world they live in." Her words stayed with him, grounding him whenever the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm him. He began to see his role not as a solitary crusader, but as part of a larger tapestry woven from the efforts of many individuals working toward the same goal. Each conversation, each forum, each gesture of support added another thread to that tapestry, strengthening it bit by bit. One particularly poignant moment came during a community event organized by a local nonprofit focused on youth mentorship. Judge Thompson had agreed to participate in a Q&A session, expecting a small turnout. Instead, the auditorium was packed with teenagers, parents, teachers, and volunteers, all eager to hear what he had to say. As he took the stage, he scanned the sea of faces, struck by their diversity and energy. For a brief moment, he forgot his prepared remarks, overwhelmed by the realization that these young people represented the future. Justice isn't just something we talk about in courtrooms, he began, his voice soft but steady. It's something we live every day in our homes, our schools, our workplaces. It's about treating others with kindness, fairness, and respect, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He went on to share his own experiences, the challenges he'd faced growing up, the obstacles he'd overcome to become a judge, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. When he recounted the incident with Officer Hayes, the audience listened intently, their expressions shifting from shock to admiration. By the time he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, echoing off the walls like waves crashing against a shore. Afterward, dozens of attendees lined up to thank him, shaking his hand or giving him hugs. A teenage girl approached him, last, clutching a notebook tightly to her chest. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the strap of her bag before finally gathering the courage to speak. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I want to be a lawyer someday, but sometimes I feel like the world doesn't think I belong there. Hearing your story makes me believe maybe I do." Judge Thompson smiled warmly, leaning down slightly to meet her gaze. "You absolutely belong there," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The world needs people like you, people who care deeply about fairness and aren't afraid to fight for it." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, then turned to leave, clutching her notebook even tighter. Watching her go, Judge Thompson felt a surge of pride, not because of anything he'd accomplished, but because of the potential he saw in others. That night as he drove home, he replayed the encounter in his mind, letting it fill him with renewed purpose. As the months stretched into years, the legacy of the courthouse incident continued to unfold. Officer Hayes remained on desk duty, his career effectively stalled by the reprimand. While some argued that the punishment wasn't severe enough, others pointed out that real change often required patience and persistence. In response, Judge Thompson emphasized the importance of systemic reforms over individual penalties. "Accountability is crucial," he said in interviews, "but so is education. We need policies that address the root causes of bias, not just band-aids for symptoms." Meanwhile, the police department implemented the promised bias training programs, partnering with experts to design curricula aimed at fostering empathy and understanding. Though the process was slow and met with resistance in some quarters, early results showed promise. Officers reported feeling more equipped to handle sensitive situations, while community members noted improvements in interactions with law enforcement. Judge Thompson attended several training sessions himself, offering insights drawn from his own experiences. His participation sent a powerful message. Justice wasn't confined to courtrooms, it extended to every corner of society. On the personal front, Judge Thompson's commitment to advocacy deepened his relationships with those around him. Colleagues who had once kept their distance now sought his advice, recognizing the value of his perspective. Friends rallied around him, celebrating milestones and supporting him through setbacks. Even strangers reached out, sharing stories of how his example had inspired them to take action in their own lives. One letter, written by a retired teacher from another state, stood out. "Your courage reminded me that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it," she wrote. "Thank you for showing us that justice begins with ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things." Years later, as Judge Thompson prepared to retire after decades of service, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The courtroom that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a second home, filled with memories of triumphs and trials alike. He thought about the countless individuals whose lives had intersected with his, defendants seeking redemption, victims yearning for closure, attorneys striving for truth. And yes, even Officer Hayes, whose actions had inadvertently sparked a chain reaction of growth and transformation. His retirement ceremony was held in the Courthouse rotunda, surrounded by towering columns and portraits of those who had come before him. Friends, family, colleagues, and community members gathered to honor his contributions, their speeches brimming with gratitude and admiration. Reverend James Holloway delivered the closing remarks, his voice resonating through the hall. Judge Thompson has taught us that justice isn't just a concept, it's a practice, Reverend Holloway said, his gaze sweeping across the audience. He has shown us that true leadership means using your voice not for yourself but for others. And he has reminded us that even in the face of adversity, hope can prevail if we stand together. When it was Judge Thompson's turn to speak, he stepped to the podium with quiet dignity. Looking out at the crowd, he allowed himself a moment of reflection before beginning. When I first put on this robe all those years ago, I never imagined the twists and turns my career would take, he said, pausing to smile. I certainly never imagined I'd find myself at the center of a national conversation, but looking back, I wouldn't trade any of it. Not the challenges, not the heartaches, not the victories. Because each step of the way, I've been reminded of why I chose this path: to serve, to listen, and to fight for what's fair. His final words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Justice isn't perfect, it isn't quick, but it's ours to shape. And if we keep working together, I believe we can create a world where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The applause that followed was deafening, a testament to the impact he'd made. As Judge Thompson stepped away from the podium, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead for society might still be long, but he knew that the seeds he'd planted would continue to grow. Change wasn't linear, and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. And that possibility, however fragile, was worth everything.